Good morning, just about everybody. I'm Claire Fox. I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas, and I was delighted to be asked by Heather Kroll to chair this session, which is called Fund Your Doc, but at What Price? And it follows on from a really interesting, excellent, thought-provoking session earlier this morning that Alex kind of ran on branding docs. Now, some of you will have been at that. A lot of you won't have been at it. Not everyone on the panel was there. But Alex is going to, we're going to kind of reflect back on some of the themes that came out of that. But this is not just about branding. So I'm just going to set the scene and introduce my panel. One thing I'd like to suggest is that although we're in a chapel, the atmosphere should be irreverent rather than reverent. I'm hoping that once the panellists have spoken for 5 minutes or so each, with the exception of Alex, who we're just going to kind of carry on the conversation from earlier, we're then going to have a bit of a discussion on the panel ourselves. There's no clips. You can tell I don't work in the business. I didn't even know what they meant when they said that. So everyone has got to speak. We can then have a kind of lively exchange here at the front. The ideal will be that it's the kind of dinner party row that you're watching, and then we invite you to join in. And at least half of the time of this session is going to be coming out to the audience and kind of just picking things up and quite conversational. All right, let me set the scene. You hardly need be reminded of the economic circumstances that we find ourselves in relation to the recession, the cuts, the impending doom and gloom. I've just come back from Lisbon in the kind of peripheral Eurozone countries, and the general atmosphere of, oh my God, there's no money, what are we going to do? And if you, of course, work in documentary and you want to make films and you want to get them funded, this doesn't feel like the ideal golden time. A lot of the government film agencies, the TV commissions, the distribution advances of old feel like they're hardly going to secure funding into the future. So, understandably, people are trying to be creative and looking around for new ways of funding their films. There's the whole crowdsourcing issue, where we try and raise money in advance from individuals sympathetic to what the film is going to do. But, of course, is there a danger then that you're simply raising funding from people who already agree with your message, and it might put a dampener on any kind of open-minded journalistic endeavour that you might pursue as a consequence of that? But it's certainly an interesting model that's emerged. There's then the branded documentaries. I'm not going to go through all the different types that there are, but there's definitely opportunities from a funding point of view. People will probably have seen Morgan Spurlock's The Greatest Film Ever Sold, which was on here last year, looking at, with some wit, at some of the issues in relation to editorial independence. Obviously there's always the danger, well, can you make a film that's branded, but would that certainly mean that you couldn't say anything that might offend that particular corporation's reputation? Sometimes people fear that this will lead to thinly disguised advertorials. But maybe a more pressing question would be, will corporations be prepared to fund films that are risky, ask difficult questions, not about their own corporation, but just generally, if they want to be associated with a feel-good product, how is there a danger that there will be less films that will rock the boat? And then I suppose the kind of final thing that I've asked the panel to just consider is a slightly new kid on the block, which is the apparent willingness, at least even though it's only a small area, but it's a growing one, for social change finance. A lot of foundations, NGOs and charities, which appear to be, organisations fairly free from the grubby world of money-making, are looking to be involved in the backing of documentary films. And I think that often they will appear to be the good guys in all this. They're not those kind of dirty money men. They have the best intentions. Maybe they're considered to be fairly kind of above criticism. And even some corporations are moving into that, setting up their own foundations or using their corporate social responsibility budgets, which they say have got nothing to do with the particular products produced by the company, to actually have social change. And so we want to look at, is that really a way forward? It would seem that it appeals to some people. But I think it's worth us noting that those foundations and NGOs and charities often themselves are brands, that they have agendas, that sometimes there's pressure on films to act as arm's-length campaigners. What if a more complicated story needs to be told than that which the charities are involved in, where it's not so black and white who the good guys are? And so I think that we're just interested in looking through some of these issues. They're not without ethical dilemmas. I don't want to set up too many straw men. We all know that there's a danger of talking about a golden age of TV commissioning editors and public service money, and, you know, maybe it wasn't such a golden age anyway. Who's to say that TV commissioners didn't interfere in content? And maybe we're kind of just harping back to the good old days. Maybe it's good to be forced. I mean, I hate to make a virtue out of having no money, but as I've never had any money as an organisation, the Institute of Ideas, I mean, it is the case that with very small budgets, we do punch way above our weight. So there are times when having no money can force you to be creative, and a kind of welfare dependency type relationship with public money in the past might have actually made people complacent and not necessarily created the best films. So, you know, we've got a number of things to consider. The one thing I really want to keep in the back of our mind, though, is filmmaking independence, what that really means. Actually, I'm going to do a bit of product placement now and advertorial. So at 2 o'clock, there'll be a wonderful session on at which Nick Fraser is going to ruthlessly push his new pamphlet, Why Documentaries Matter, and I'm going to do the in-conversation with him. But actually, it's a really interesting pamphlet, well worth reading, because although everybody at Sheffield might think they know why documentaries matter, I think when you read the pamphlet, you realise that there's not a straightforward way that you can just argue for or defend documentaries, and he certainly made me think. But one of the things that he makes a point in the pamphlet, which I wanted to quote just to kick things off, was the only criterion, Nick says, whether it's private or corporate funding for new projects or philanthropic funding, is does it support the independence of the filmmaker? And he says, documentaries remain interesting to us as a consequence of the state of freedom which they and their makers exist. They should not be the exclusive property either of a lobby devoted to good intentions, nor a heavily subsidised system producing artefacts for display in the art houses or conscripted in the struggle to preserve national, regional or ethnic cultures. And I think what the point of that is to just say, how do filmmakers stay independent whilst being not too prissy about where they get their money? That's what we want to look at. So the order in which people will speak is we're starting off with Mette Hoffman-Meyer, who's head of Docs DRTV, responsible for 4 channels showing 1,100 hours of documentary and factual programming in all genres every year. And in addition to international production, Mette commissions local Danish films as well. She's a board member of Steps International that spearheaded the award-winning Why Democracy series, which obviously Nick is also associated with, and is now involved in the Why Poverty series, which maybe we'll discuss later, which the film should be associated with that, out in November. We've then got Jennifer Merrin, who's a film critic and journalist of some renown internationally. She covers documentaries for About.com, a division of New York Times. She's a film critic for Women's E-News, president of the Alliance of Women Film Journalists. Jennifer's been a columnist for AP, for LA Times, Chicago Tribune, correspondent for CBS, NBC, CNN. She's done it all, really. She grew up in Hollywood, now New York based, and the main thing is that she's an outspoken advocate for documentaries, and as you'll discover, an argumentative thorn in the side of every discussion, which is why it's always good to have her here. And talking of thorns in the side, we then have Nick Fraser, editor of Storyville, which he has worked on since it started in 1997. He's worked as a reporter, television producer, and an editor. Storyville films have won more than 200 awards, 4 Oscars, Sundance Grand Jury Prize, several Graysons, Emmys, and Peabodys. Nick is the author of the biography of Eva Peron, the voice of modern hatred. What?
What a terrible idea.
Oh, yeah, exactly. The voice of modern hatred, which is actually a good book. The story of extremism and race hatred in Europe, which is actually well worth looking at in today's circumstances. The importance of being eaten, and now, as I've said, why documentaries matter. And then finally, Alex Cannock, who's the director of new business at Shine UK. He previously co-founded and ran Factual TV, the Factual TV group 10 Alps. He's a visiting fellow at the Oxford University Reuters Institute and at the Manchester Business School, and director of digital innovation at Manchester Metropolitan University. So before they say anything, let's give them a clap, or we can boo them later. Okay, right, that's the kind of formal bit out of the way. Now, people are just going to give us their opening thoughts for 5 minutes, and I'm going to ask Meta to kick us off.
Yeah.
You don't have to.
Hi. Well, you did say some of what I've written down. I've actually written something down the first time in my life. Claire asked me to send a list of what I've been writing, but I've actually never written anything. I cannot write, and I hardly can read, but I do watch lots of documentaries, and I have done over a period of 20 years, so maybe 1,000 a year, so that adds up to about 20,000 documentaries. And I have a few here, 6 that's in competition that I have commissioned, so go and see them. But when I first started to commission films, documentary filmmakers came to me with ideas of stories that inspired most from indignations or something that was important that took place in our society and in the world. Most of the times, they wanted to figure out what happened and trying to find out what went on behind, the scenes and what we did not know about. They would want to find out, political scandals or, wherever the idea came from. They had no reason to fix the outcome of the research or what in the end the film would tell you or us about. They wanted to document, to show the chains of commands or the events. They wanted us to think. They wanted us and also themselves to explore what really took place, and I thought that was important at the time. We still have filmmakers who works like that and who thinks like that. But recently, and more so, films are being made with a different narrative. Now a specially missionary tone has come into the films. Not all of them, but some of them. There are films with very fixed endings. They want you to feel or think and see the world the way they see them, without, unfortunately, a real argument in the film. And the world becomes black or white. I think you used that phrase as well. These stories have to fit into a certain predefined world look. They are not limited by facts or documentation, but want to send the message of a specific interest group or one-person view, or how the world should be. I'm not very good in reading, you can see. When I started watching films, I also watched film it was in the Cold War, and that was in full floor. We were laughing when we came across propaganda films, and we talked about in my little community how stupid the leaders in these countries must be, and how stupid they were to think that the people in their country would believe what they saw. We were sure the people would look through what they were being told and react to these indoctrinating tones and glamorizing hard work in the fields of Russia, or bringing in the hay, or working in factories, hard work in the factories all day, singing songs all along. This goes also all the way back to Lene Riefenstahl and her films in the 30s that helped Hitler into full power. The films from Mao and Lenin's regimes, and recently some fantastic films has come out of North Korea and Kim Il-jong. Propaganda film they were called, and we all thought that it was a bit of a waste, and also we did not like that they did not have any alternative. Today, the indoctrinating, one-sided and manipulative films are not paid by dictators and the people or communists like Lenin and Martin, or the funders, and the funders are not dressed in military uniforms. Today, they are being paid for by what we call political correct, sometimes, or most of the time, very rich liberals in America, or special interest groups, or foundations with missions beyond imagination. Social change is a buzzword, and the money are being paid through what they call CSR, corporate social responsibility. When I screen all the films in my work, I never really want to know who's behind them and who has made them. I want the films to speak for themselves. So I put in the DVDs in the machines, or the link, tab into the link. But more and more often I get the feeling that this is not a film where the filmmakers are searching for answers or finding the truth. This is films that are searching for people or clips or visuals that they use as vehicles to tell the stories that the funders wanted to tell. They want us as viewers to be trapped into a certain worldview, just like they did when they did the propaganda films some years ago. You would hope that the dictators would keep their integrity, and you would also hope that you could find their own views and voice in the films. But it's rarely like that. I'm sure you've all experienced situations where you know what a person you sit and talk to is going to say. And I more and more often find that I experience that when I watch these films, I know what they want to say in the end. I know what they want me to think. And I want, and it's hardly place, unfortunately, for me to reflect on the film afterwards or have anything sort of interesting thoughts afterwards, because it's all being funneled into this predestined argumentation, or if there is this argumentation at all. Most of the times, our stories is often clearly trapping the viewer into these conclusions. Then I can't read my notes. Not good. When Eastern European filmmakers and Asian, I travel all around the world and I meet filmmakers all around the world. And, still a lot of filmmakers from Asia and China and Eastern Europe, they use the word when they pitch that the hero of the film. And, because you know the history, and so you know that that's normal, and that's what would be natural in their recent history. And in Scandinavia, because we react to when we hear the word hero, because we don't want a hero in a film like that. We want a hero to be explored and find out, is he really a hero? We want a three-dimensional view on the person or the things that takes place. So we I sort of spit, what does he mean about a hero? But nowadays, heroes are also used in American movies, and Bush very clearly reintroduced the good and the bad terminology in a very clear way when he said, you're either with us or against us. And then I feel that a lot of the new films or the recent films are being made in that spirit or in that terminology, either you're with us or you're against us. Unfortunately, not much good comes out of this simple ambition in a storytelling, and how can films be interesting if the filmmaker is told what to say in the film? And you and I, we know that already after 2 or 3 minutes that this is the purpose of the film. So I would say, just to finish up, is that what sort in danger is that we are selling out on integrity with these very defined and very fundings that comes from corporates with certain ideas of life. And then I also think in the long run it is dumbing down the audience and the people and us, and in the long run, maybe damaging our view on democracy.
Thank you very much. That was really excellent, Mette. Well, that was excellent, uncompromising introduction to the theme, but is exactly the kind of things that I think we want to talk about, that need to be talked about and confronted, so that is really useful. Jennifer, do you want to share some thoughts?
Yeah, I don't have any notes, so forgive me, but I think that this is an extremely important subject to discuss at this particular time, in which the funding environment for filmmakers is extremely tough. We all know that, we acknowledge that, and I'm in a position where I don't have to apply to anybody for funding. I don't make films, so I'm outside of those particular interests, and I have the luxury of being able to look at this situation from the standpoint of a person who connects documentaries with the public and with public perception of documentaries and public perception of what documentaries represent of the world in which we live. So that has, Nick will be speaking about that in particular at 2, and I'm not going to go there right now, but the corporate funding of documentary film is a very slippery slope. And people are getting to the top of that slope, filmmakers, and beginning to slide down it without actually looking at what the consequences of what that first step means in the long run. We have to consider actually what a documentary film is. And how it is different from any other media at this particular point, and what role does it actually play in society? In the United States, I of course speak from an American context because I am American, but we need documentaries very, very much. We need the independent voice in media. We need to have an unquestionable source of information that exists outside of or is available to us outside of our mainstream media, which is owned practically entirely by corporations at this point. It has become infotainment rather than actual news, and our sources are very limited, and the United States continues to be a very influential world power, both politically and culturally. So the source for people who are the public, for people who are looking to media for information that is going to influence the way in which they behave is we have to keep that as being something beyond question, its integrity beyond question. Documentary filmmaking, the definition of documentary filmmaking was one of the things that I look at very often in my work, and differentiating documentary from narrative. Everyone's talking about documentary now as storytelling. It is storytelling, but there are several things that actually differentiate it from narrative fiction film. For one thing, the conclusion is not known. The filmmaker takes the audience on a voyage of discovery, and granted or true that in the editing process that voyage of discovery is manipulated so that the audience is able to come to some sort of a conclusion about what they've seen, or at least face some of the issues about what they've seen. But there is no conclusion to a story in documentary. The documentary ends, the situation that it's talking about goes on. And so there's a different audience involvement, a different audience engagement, a different audience interaction with the documentary film than with a narrative film. Why is that important here? Because when you allow corporations that have, no matter whether they're publicly interested or they're good corporations or they're just big, heavy industry mega corporations that have multinational, that have egregious practices from China to Antarctica, they all have agendas, and whatever money they put into a film, a documentary film, is attached to some form of an agenda that has to do with their marketing. It has nothing to do with the efficacy of the film. It has nothing to do with the integrity of the film. It has nothing to do with anything other than what they want to sell. Sometimes they are selling product. Sometimes they're selling image. We're looking at examples now of corporate funding that have already been put in place that are really quite terrifying to me. Forward Focus, which is, if I'm going on too long here, tell me, but Forward Focus, which is an initiative that was begun between Morgan Spurlock and Cineland, and General Electric. General Electric is probably, as you know, one of the worst corporate entities in the entire world when it comes to record. There are websites. If you look up corporate compliance or corporate grievances and connect it with General Electric, you will find lists of lawsuits that are against General Electric that have been placed in the public interest that have to do with water, have to do with energy, have to do with almost every issue that documentary film deals with. Well, in one fell swoop, General Electric has commissioned 30 highly respected American documentary filmmakers, some of whom have reputations that are beyond reproach, really beyond reproach. They are icons of integrity, and identified the corporate branding of General Electric with their names. The initiative is called Focus Forward. It has a presence here at Sheffield. It had a presence at Cannes. It will have a presence at IDFA. These are 3-minute documentaries, they're called documentaries, that have to do with the theme of innovation. Innovation is GE's code word. It's its logo, its branding logo, its theme, its keyword, innovation and GE. Just investigate this for a moment yourselves. I don't want to go on and on about what the intricate arrangements are and all of that. And find out think to yourself or question whether or not these filmmakers who have, in fact, made films that are about water, about fresh water, about energy, about toxic waste, about a lot of other things, whether they've lost something of their position to actually take a firm stand on these issues because of their affiliation with GE. I don't think that those filmmakers questioned what they were doing, and I think that it is extremely important, and they're very sophisticated, these guys. I think it's extremely important, especially for young filmmakers who may be totally desperate for money to complete their films at this point, to really take a hard look at what it is that you're giving up when you accept funding from a corporation.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. If General Electric are in, I'm looking for funding, and I've got less scruples than Jennifer, so come and talk to me later. But obviously, raising a different kind of alarm about the kind of corporate side than we've heard from Meta. So, Nick, your take on this, please.
Right. I'm going to try, it was very sweet what Claire said about my pamphlet, and I'll try to talk to you a bit more about independence. I think it's really difficult to be an independent writer, an independent journalist, and an independent filmmaker, and I've actually spent quite a lot of my life trying to figure out what that means and trying to help people to be independent. When I first went to the BBC to ask for a job, I think it was in 1972, and I was ushered into a room in a now ripped-down piece of the BBC where there was a man in a tweed suit, and you could tell immediately he had sort of MI5 written over his forehead. And he asked me all about my political allegiances to figure out whether, like Alan Hayling, I was a communist or not. And of course, I was able to say, no, I wasn't a communist. I might have said, I've been educated at Eton and I'm not a communist. What do you expect? Anyhow, he then asked me, he said, well, why do you want to work for the BBC? So I had a list of brilliant, controversial, aggressive programs that I reeled out to him, and he tapped me on the elbow across the desk, and he said, if you want to work for the BBC, you should never say you're interested in programs. You should say you want to work for the BBC. And you have to remember that 1984 is based on the BBC, and that until recently, a system of ideological control, soft though it may have been, prevailed, and many, many views were excluded. Now, I mention this because the Chinese are not here at Sheffield. And did anyone see 2 years ago a film that Storyville showed called Petition? No, you didn't see it. Well, Petition took 10 years to make. It's bad you didn't see it. It's worthy of George Orwell. It took 10 years to make, and it's a story of a court that dates from Mandarin times. And if your life has been wrecked by a Mandarin, you are able, in current Beijing, you now do it on the internet, I have to say, but then you could post a petition through a hole in the wall, as in Mandarin times. The problem is you had to wait about 8 years for a response from the court, and the court's proceedings were held in private. And this man made a film about this. It's an extraordinary film. And the point of my story is that the film was shown outside China. It was distributed by a French company. It was shown by us, small audiences everywhere. And the Chinese broadcasting authorities came to the filmmaker and they said, "We saw your film and we hated it." And it was very anti-Chinese. And you can understand why no one in China must be allowed to watch this film. But we have a suggestion. For your next film, we will give you a lot of money. We know you have no money. We know you have no money at all. And you will do a film that we like, and you will be censored by us. Well, I don't think we live in a wholly different world from the world experienced by this Chinese filmmaker. It's different, but it's not totally different. And I think we should approach the question of independence with some humility. Okay, I'm now going to talk to you briefly about why poverty, and not just to plug this wonderful effort, but to tell you how difficult some bits of our encounters, Meta and my encounters, have been. These are 8 films about the current state of global poverty, and there are 30 shorts, and there's a website. And for the past 2 years, I have been in NGO land. I have encountered private investors, rich liberals, NGOs, charities, broadcasters, the whole lot. And I can tell you with my hand on my heart that the best people to work with are public broadcasters. When you go to these people, you ask them favors. Mel and I, we get on our knees and we ask them for money. And they take an inordinate amount of time to come up with the money. But I don't blame them for that. What they want, however, is something in return. And they're not like the BBC censor or the Chinese censor. They tell you they want something in return, but they don't tell you what they want what it is they want in return. You go to the proceedings of the Good Pitch, and you'll notice that they are friction-free. They are the end of history, a world without discussion because everybody agrees with each other. Well, let me tell you, in life, that is an illusion. The best thing in life is to recognize who doesn't agree with you, and if you don't like them, in the style of my old friend Christopher Hitchens, you go for them and you kill them. And it is people like that we should be looking for. We should nourish people like that. Now, the point about why poverty is that we managed to fund these 8 shows wholly through broadcasters. So they are just about as independent as you can get under present circumstances. Now, Claire is an enormously subtle dialectician in these matters, but before I sign off, I'd just like to say a few things about what I've learned about broadcasters in the last few years. I said earlier that broadcasters are the best source of independence, but latterly, in relation to documentary filmmakers, and I think in relation to news values too, there's been a certain slippage among broadcasters. Broadcasters do not cherish your work if you're independent filmmakers. I accept from this partially, totally, partially, just about the BBC. The BBC's gone a long way since my encounter with the tweeded representative MI5. I think, in part thanks to the BBC's sponsorship of Storyville, which occupies a marginal but sort of central place, the BBC's gotten better at independent voices. But I notice a sliding backwards of Channel 4, which has drifted further and further into marketing speak when it comes to its own voice or the voices it accommodates. I think it was a minor scandal that Channel 4 dumped documentaries on More 4. I think it was a minor scandal that nobody complained about it. I think Channel 4 should be held to its responsibilities. I think, by the way, that the fact that ITV shows a lot more documentaries is very hopeful. So the picture isn't black. But you ought to be able to remind broadcasters if they don't stand for pluralism, if they don't stand for individual voices, if they don't not just harbour but cherish documentaries, they're not doing their job. And one of the recommendations of my pamphlet is that in future, when licenses are issued, there should be quotas, there should be numbers, there should be budgets about documentaries. We know enough about what documentaries are to be able to specify that they should be shown by broadcasters. So I'll just leave you with the thought that really it all comes down to independence, that freedom, not freedom in a George Bush sense, as Meta described it, but the freedom to make what you want, to have it shown to many, many people, is something that all broadcasters should sustain, and I don't see the point of being a documentary filmmaker if these conditions don't obtain.
Thank you very much. Stirring stuff from Nick and a call to arms at the same time. Okay, so I'm just going to turn to you, Alex, really because I thought one of the fascinating things from your session was the survey that you did and the things which people were prepared to make compromises on and not. And just because you weren't there, I think it might be worth rehearsing some of those. So it was just very interesting that people were wary of making a film maybe for an oil company that was about oil, but didn't mind making films for an oil company about malaria. I mean, but you just want to kind of say a few thoughts on that kind of thing, and then I'll ask you a few more questions.
Sure. So what I did was very kindly, Heather gave me the mailing list of the Sheffield Documentary Festival, and we sent out a pretty detailed survey to everybody on that list, and a few hundred people got back to us in quite some detail. And we asked a lot of questions which were designed to be very leading and to put them into situations of moral compromise. And they sure fell into it, I can tell you that. So, for example, we asked them a question, if you were making a documentary, a factual TV program sponsored by a laptop company, would you be happy to exclude shots of rival company laptops? And everybody said, about 25% of people said, sure, I would exclude. And the other 75%, oh, definitely not, I wouldn't exclude. And then we said, the boss of the laptop company's come back and said that they won't commission the program again, and all 20 people on the team will lose their jobs if you don't take out all the shots of rival laptops. And 88% of people then capitulated. And I think that's quite interesting, because what it showed is that this business of kind of moral compromise is very real. And that in the context of constrained funding, documentary makers or factual TV makers, and I appreciate there is a distinction, but nonetheless, those people collectively are very prepared to compromise. The question to which Claire alludes is a different one, which was, I was trying to get to the bottom of what it was about a funder that made people either agree to work with them or not to work with them. So we asked two questions. First of all, would you make a documentary about an oil company, the environmental impact of an oil company drilling in Antarctica, sponsored by that oil company? And the great majority of people wouldn't make that film. And then we asked the same question again, would you make a documentary about interesting new malaria treatments in Africa, sponsored by the oil company? And the answer was overwhelmingly yes. So in other words, it wasn't the oil company itself that was the, if you like, moral problem, notwithstanding whatever company that might have been or whatever environmental damage it may be doing in Antarctica. It was the fact of the linkage between the direct activities of that company and the content of the documentary. So it's much more about the content than the source of the funding. I suppose the only one other observation I would make to Nick's point is I don't think anyone in this room would disagree that it would be nice to abolish poverty or it would be nice to abolish political repression or anything else. These are all obvious absolutes, in just the same way that it would be nice for all documentaries to be funded by state broadcasters. Unfortunately, except in Britain and a few other European countries, that is just simply not a practical option on the table at all. And if you say, we only want money from state broadcasters, what you're actually saying in translation is, we want there to be dramatically fewer factual TV programs and documentaries produced around the world, full stop. So an example we referred to before was that in Brazil, about 75% of all factual TV is actually directly corporate funded. If we were to be absolutist about it, what we're saying is we only want there to be a quarter of the amount of factual TV in Brazil that there is now, because we want to live in this perfect moral world. And what I would say is, actually, I think the combination of my survey and the reality that actually you do need multiple sources of funding and not just state license fee broadcasters involved says that we have to try and get to a place where we can work in these kind of potentially compromised environments and find ways through that rather than sitting back and saying, I'm only going to do one kind of thing.
Okay, thanks. That's really useful, Alex. By the way, if you want to tweet, I'm very tempted to tweet myself, but anyway, if you want to tweet, Alex is controlling the tweet responses. If you want to say something and you don't want to put your hands up,
just use the hashtag ChefDocFest.
Yeah. So you tweet. Not the panel.
No.
Well, I just want to ask a question. Right.
We can tweet.
Two things. Actually, I wanted to just ask you, Mette, for a start. Actually, and it refers to an example that was given from the front in Alex's panel, because one of the things that I thought that in relation to what Jennifer was saying was, I've actually found when I've come to Sheffield and when I've talked to documentary filmmakers that they're actually rather sceptical of corporate funding. Big bad oil is big bad oil, and although they might get desperate and say, oh, well, 20 colleagues might lose a job and I might sell my soul, they kind of see it as selling their soul. But what is less common in this debate is that people actually have any kind of equivalence with other organisations that are not corporates, like with the foundations or with the NGO world, even though often they are multi-million-pound organisations. And so one of the things that came up in the last example was the example of, I think it's a company called Arla that makes
it's
butter.
Danish.
Yeah, it's Danish. There you go.
Big Danish company.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. I didn't know what I was talking about. I knew they did dairy products. Anyway, they want to make and they've got together with the English National Trust, and there's a call for documentaries, which I think is going to be made, about how children in Britain don't have a close enough relationship with nature, and that this is kind of going ahead. And I was thinking about when I felt very uncomfortable when I heard this, because it's a little bit like you were saying, which is I obviously know the answer before I've seen. I now know the answer before I've seen the film, and there's another side of an argument that might say that being close to nature, something which peasants are less romantic about maybe than filmmakers, is not so pleasant, right? And it's not necessarily a good. I could see this kind of. What kind of film was going to happen. But do you want to just kind of look at that? Because there was no hesitation that was a good thing, because it's kids, close to nature, we're all green these days, National Trust involved. Anyway.
They want them to know how a tree looks and a cow and a pig and stuff, So I think what Arla is doing, they do that in Denmark already, is that when you buy your bottle of milk every day, there's something CSR content on it, with take your kids out in the forest and stuff like that. But I think I'm probably very fundamental about these things, because I think, like Christopher Hitchens, that you can't bend the Bible, you cannot decide who's right. Whether it's the Bible, the Quran, or whatever, you can have liberal Muslims, or you have liberal Christians, or you have fundamentalists. Who decides, who interprets this the right way? And you cannot say that I am right and the others are not, or you can take a little bit of money or not. I think, for me, it's simple. For Danish public broadcast, we don't allow these things, so we cannot do it. It's got to be... we cannot make a film that's funded by a corporation. But I also think that in terms of integrity, and when a filmmaker wants to tell the story, you kind of want them to look at an issue and then explore from there and investigate and find documentation and talk to people who knows about it and make a film that's as close to the truth as you can come. And if you then think that all your money and your company is depending on this money from Arla, and you need to put in lots of nice cows that are, and milking girls and whatever, it's the whole trust. You cannot trust the films also when money comes in like that, because it can be small things, and we all know how you can manipulate with films and being done to us every day, and as executive producer and commission editor, I have to look at films and cuts all the time, and you figure out things. I can actually spot it there's something wrong here, and I call the director and say, even if it's from Brazil or wherever, what's going on here? And often when I don't spot it all the time, but I feel that there's something wrong in this argumentation, and you go back. So I think you cannot bend it. I think you have to, if you want to do a documentary, you do a documentary, otherwise it's not a documentary, you do a commercial, and call it a commercial and make it as a commercial sponsored by Arla, and Arla can make commercials on all the commercial TVs about kids going out in the forest.
Okay, Nick, I mean, my dilemma is, you mentioned Hitchens, Christopher. Yeah. I like polemics, and I'm involved in politics, and I'm not opposed to campaigning. And yet I find myself very nervous, as you know, about campaigning political documentaries, even the ones that appear to have polemics. At the moment, I was listening to Meta, and I thought one of the secrets in what she said was that often these films don't have an argument, they have a presumption. Mm-hmm. They have a presumption that you, the audience, will agree with them. We all know what side we're on, and it actually lacks the building blocks of an argument. And the investigation. But do you recognise that, or am I being too cynical?
No, I think you've absolutely spotted the right. As Graham Greene said that he was a novelist so long it took him about 3 pages to spot the flaw in the plot, and he was like a dry rot inspector. He looked at the house, there's the dry rot, and the fact is, and I'd like to ask Alex about this, that people like Meta and myself, we watch so many documentaries, we know at once there's something wrong. There's actually no excuse for, the creeping in of messages, the showing of films financed by the Malaysian Industrial Board. You know at once about these films. There's something wrong. They're not independent. They've got a slant in them that isn't overt. I think you spotted what's wrong about these. It's a difference between controversy. You make, in a very good word, in your career, in a very good way, you make controversy. You deliver controversy to us, and we enjoy it. And that's what you do as an organization. These films aim to slant controversy. They are not prima facie, they're not Hitchensites, they're not open people, they're not Tom Paine people. They carry the interests of companies, or they carry the interests of NGOs. So they're far from being controversial. They're on one side of the argument. And the steps, the building blocks, are not put in because the sponsors, and therefore the filmmakers, are not interested in the building blocks. They're not told, well, it's very important for you to have the building blocks. They're told, well, the message is important. And as soon as you get in this position, you have shit films, just like you have shit articles. And we know the articles because in newspapers, they're called supplements. They are called supplements. You open up, here's the Malaysian Industrial Board, and it's bought 4 pages in the Times. Or, I have to say, here is something about The Guardian dealing with development, and you kind of know it's got the Oxfam line in it. It's not going to take a sort of hard-ass, difficult attitude to development. It's going to say what Oxfam wants. Nothing wrong with what Oxfam wants, except it does not make for good journalism. It does not make for journalism at all, and we should simply apply the same criteria to films.
Okay, thanks. You were in the last session, Jennifer, with myself, and I think a good point was made by Tessa Mays, I don't know if she's in, where she said, but, a lot of the audience are savvy. Now, this is less about the kind of things we've been talking about, but in terms of, like, product placements or all the rest of it. So there's that side to it. Are we being a bit, the audience get it, right? They don't really need, maybe we should just take the money and so on. There's that thing I wanted to ask you. And the second thing was, I take corporate funding for the Institute of Ideas. I'm not saying this is some kind of transparency declaration, by the way. I've taken oil money from Shell and from Statoil, in fact. I've just lost the money from Shell, which is a bit of a tragedy, if anything. But anyway,
don't do Shell anymore.
No, I know. No. But I take corporate money to retain independence, because I don't like taking state funding, because whenever I went to try and get state funding for an independent organisation, they told me what to say and what to do. So I now say, this is what I do, and I try and raise money on the back of it from anyone. I don't mean I just target corporates. I mean, I'll take it from anyone. And there was something in what you were saying, because you were saying that those filmmakers, by getting in bed with GE, were somehow tainted. Well, I don't know if I agree with you on that. I mean, isn't that a bit... I mean, money doesn't grow on trees, as it were. I mean, people have to get money from somewhere. Maybe you could get corporate money. I don't care what the corporates are trying to do with it. They're not... I know what I want, and I would need to fund it. So just play around with some of that.
Well, I mean, I think you need, as a filmmaker... put it this way: you have what you want to call a message, a story, whatever it is. You're on an investigation, and the investigation, as long as you stick to what the investigation is in your filmmaking, you need to be able to know what you want, really, and what your long-term objective is. There's a huge difference between documentary and propaganda. You need to be absolutely brutal, I think, with yourself about when what you're doing and what you're accepting moves you over into the realm of propaganda, where you are being used by, or your initiative is being used by a corporation in order to achieve their agenda with which you may or may not agree. I mean, I think it's an individual filmmaker decision, but I think it's a decision that really has to be faced very honestly and brutally. I think you need to really be brutal with yourself. I think there are other ways of looking for funding other than just accepting this corporate business. If you can accept a corporate sponsorship. I think your acceptance, for example, of, and we discussed this a bit, of funding from Shell, which is another, it's a monster corporation in my thinking anyway.
That's a small corporation that's become bigger.
Yeah, well, but I think that your take on it and the way in which you have treated or approached that is a very subversive one. I think if you're subversive about your acceptance of funding, and you know what it is that you gain and lose from it, then you can't make hard rules here. Everyone is looking to be able to complete projects. And the other thing that I really wanted to introduce here is that as long as documentary filmmakers will accept funding from private corporations, they are doing what in the United States has really become a continuation of Reaganomics that's applied now to the documentary world. It's privatization of public interest. Corporations are not being taxed because they're giving money to documentary films or they're going in that route. They are not being judged. They are being allowed to present their agenda on a different marketing level than has been previously defined. So it's a very slippery slope there. I don't know whether I'm answering your question, but
no, that's fine. It's okay. I just want to go out to the audience, but
questions.
I think that people want to come in, and I'll come back. Alex, if you've got anything you wanted to respond to from earlier, but I'll take a few points now. So I'll just gather together some thoughts. Answer the questions, be provocative, or ask questions, either way. And there was somebody there. And always nice if you just say who you are by name, at least.
Hello, I'm Miriam Lyons, an independent filmmaker.
So, can't hear you.
Sorry, Miriam Lyons, independent filmmaker. Just wanted to ask the question about why we're seeing it as top-down. So why we're talking about filmmakers as though we're powerless. We're artists, we have the ability to challenge and question, and that's our job, mainly. So why are we just accepting briefs from corporations as though we'll just do whatever they want? Why don't we go to corporations with ideas of our own that broadly cover topics like technology or love even or anything like that and just say, you're interested in the audience that I know I can generate because I make good films. Are you interested in these people and therefore give me some money?
Okay, that's a very different... That's hopefully my approach, but that's kind of a different take. I can be in control of this. Maybe that's naive. I mean, that's what people say to me. But yeah, that gentleman there.
If you were going to take corporate funding, is it possible to kind of put in some contract where you have editorial control, even if they don't like it, your word is final, and any way to prevent them from suing you for libel? I mean, if you can get that in a legal framework, then I don't see the harm in accepting funding corporately. But if you can't protect your independence in accepting that, then you've got a problem.
Yeah, Nick.
Well, I think both these are interesting questions. I think there's no answer to your question at all about it depends on the company. If the company's mysteriously benign and going to give you the cash, fine. How do I know whether the company is mysteriously benign? As for, I was going to say, look, it seems to me, sitting in the BBC, we have to change the way we work. I don't accept, by the way, that, you know, twice you sneaked in the fact state broadcasters use substitute for... That's a show mark, out-of-date Thatcherism. There are public broadcasters, there are state broadcasters. The Chinese are state broadcasters, the BBC and Scandinavian stations are public broadcasters. It's different. But I think what we would need, we would need to loosen our rules as broadcasters for financial reasons. But I think what we kind of have to do is have a level of transparency where these sort of things are apparent, that if money came from X and Y, the money had no strings attached. And I can bore you at great length, but when this is possible, and this is what we have to do now, I have to try to convince, with great difficulty, the BBC to get real, actually, and get sensible about dealing with third-party funding. It is possible, but I would say it's very difficult. In a way, it puts an astonishing burden on the filmmaker. It's a filmmaker who has to say, hand on heart, I took money from whoever it was, from Shell or whoever it was. It made no difference to my film. So you have to tell us that. And I think it makes life very difficult for you. We have to help you.
Meta, then Alex.
Yeah, I think what really upsets me is not only the corporate funding, but actually also the whole NGO funding, but also within our own environment, within the documentary world, there's a layer now that's sneaking in, just as you have in the NGO, a layer of people who are just making a living of something that is fluffy. They charge lots of money from, they get lots of money from foundation and corporate money to run some kind of entities that make you think that they're doing something for documentaries, but actually it's just a lot of people making money and making a living, and nothing comes out of it, and very little of the money goes to the filmmaking. And that is sort of where I think it becomes really, where I don't understand that filmmakers are not rioting and demonstrating and shouting or writing about it. There's a lot of people making a living out of money that should have been going directly to
As
the
you
films.
put it, Meta, the do-good delusion.
That's a new title.
Okay, so I just to quickly intervene, because Alex wants to come in, that is actually kind of quite an interesting thing, because here we have somebody saying, can't I just go myself? I'm independent, I don't need to be protected, I can go and ask for money and then I'll make my decisions. The watertight contracts, I mean, obviously, when you ever get any money from anyone, you say, I want editorial independence. I mean, that's the assertion that everyone makes. I mean, the idea you're going to kind of watertight, I mean, you wouldn't get away with that with anyone, almost. But you can say it, but that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about much more subtle interventions. But I think this sort of like intervening bodies is something that is a new thing, because what happens is that people say, well, the filmmakers don't know how to negotiate with these new funding organisations, so there'll be another body in between. And I think that is a new thing, which we should at least say.
I mean, there's these things like Puma Vision or Hilton Award, or and you actually sell your film, and you actually also, with rights to go with it. What I hear is BritDoc Puma Award. You sell British broadcast rights for £5,000 or something. I haven't seen this contract, but that's what I hear. It's ridiculous. How is that possible that you can actually make this body, as you call it, where they don't do anything as such for the films and for the filmmakers and for the film industry, and a lot of money from the big organizations who want to help the documentary industry. These money are just disappearing because it's bureaucracy and it's difficult to look through.
Okay, thanks, Alex.
To the question over there about whether there's some sort of blueprint that you could have by which the producer would work with the company. Actually, people are working on that. We started doing it at Oxford, and then we found out that BritDoc are actually doing it at the moment. So they're trying to come up with just exactly what you describe, a blueprint as to the kind of rules of the game and what should be set up front and what should be agreed up front and so forth. So I think that that's a really noble cause. I think one of the things we found at Oxford quite difficult is If we did that in Britain, would that apply in Asia? And the truth is, no, it wouldn't. It would be completely different because they start from a completely different set of values. And for what it's worth, both TV producers and brands who I've spoken to in Asia would not understand any of this conversation or think any of it made any sense at all.
No, that's simply not true. I've had this conversation in Japan and Taiwan, and they understand exactly what we're talking about. They understand it better than we do because they have, in Taiwan, a very precious sense.
By the way, Nick mentioned Malaysia. Of course, it was the BBC itself which had problems with Malaysia.
Indeed, that's why I did, yeah.
But then the other thing is that would a foundation as a firewall necessarily be an editorial balance? And that's an interesting point because, of course, if a foundation is, for example, sponsored by a clothing company, would it self-select away from programs about films about sweatshops in Asia or whatever? So even a foundation is not necessarily a cutout between the potentially nefarious influence of a brand on content. It's a very difficult thing.
Okay, this gentleman here.
I'd just like to share with the panel something that might be the exception to the rule that you think is the rule. I'm just finishing a film on a £3 million project with an international corporate sponsor. It was the Catlin Insurance Group. And the documentary is totally separate to the whole marketing campaign of this expedition. We created a 3-year international scientific expedition. They wanted no input into the science whatsoever. It's totally independent, peer-reviewed science. The documentary is totally separate to the marketing campaign that was around the expedition. And you credit us as being intelligent filmmakers. We spent 3 years working with this brand to actually understand what they wanted to do and told them that the documentary had to be fundamentally and wholeheartedly separate to this. And they agreed, and we're actually finishing the film now. And it does work if you put the time in.
Can I just say, because I think that observation and a couple of the other things is, see, what I'm really worried about is a more insidious thing. See, I think there's a certain bits that people actually know what's going on. What I find, what gets on my nerves slightly is more your point that you made, Nick, about the supplements. I don't mean that gets on my nerves, which is, as you say, it's like the Oxfam supplement. Because for me, it's like, well, you know, I don't want to go on about oil company because I'm not being funded by them. I feel like I can just keep saying this.
No, we don't like
right, yeah. No, but big oil, everyone goes, oh, God, that must be terrible. How can we negotiate it? We have to work out what we do. But you know, worldwide, World Life, what's it called, WWF or Greenpeace, there's much less scepticism. And it was just when, you know, it's kind of like sweatshops in Asia. Everybody knows, I mean, it's what I'm trying to say, it's part of the liberal shtick. Everybody knows sweatshops in Asia are bad. And then that's it then. End of argument. Well, actually, having spent a lot of time in India, it might be a slightly more complicated story as to what kind of film you'd make. So if you kind of start off with I'm working with the NGO that's got the campaign that sweatshops are bad. It's not so much the clothing company that... I think everybody kind of go, oh, clothing companies, they are bad because they've got sweatshops in Asia. But what about the NGO that's arguing against the sweatshops in Asia in a very black and white way that means that when you investigate it, you discover that it's not as... Exactly. That's what it's that insidious influence on filmmakers that I'm worried about.
I think it's an interesting question about the BritDoc Bill of Health. I wonder what other people think. And this is not a criticism, particularly of BritDoc. I would never, never, never accept as meaning anything at all, any piece of paper put out by some organisation like BritDoc explaining that a film that's passed through their hands, rather remotely probably, has no bias in it, no discernible bias. I would expect, working for the BBC, I have to do the job myself. If I don't do the job, I would expect to be fired. And that's where I am. But would anyone, how do you think, beyond the bond or the linkage between the filmmaker and the editor, what are the ways there of telling it whether a film is bent or full of messages or not? I don't know.
Okay, so that lady there, and then that gentleman there. And Nick, can you pass me that spare water there?
Hello, my name is Lina. I'm from Malaysia, where you mentioned. There are a couple of filmmakers here. I'm a producer from Malaysia. And over in Asia, because we're Southeast Asia, we do a lot of work with in Southeast Asia, where funding is plentiful, I would say. Generally, a lot from our government. The Malaysian government is actually, they fund 8 filmmakers today to Sheffield at this time. And they've been giving a lot of money into documentaries. But we have a major problem because obviously we have to toe the government line. It's like China. And, but there are, of course, a lot of us here, filmmakers here, that we also do a lot of work for like Discovery and National Geographic, who throw money at us a lot of to say we want to do an Asian documentary in Southeast Asia, but they are also susceptible to the censorship laws of big broadcasters like an Astro, which is pay TV, which is a very big organization that controls it, and they control the Discoveries and they control the National Geographics because they tell them that what they can and cannot put up. So as documentary filmmakers, I mean, we do have to kind of toe that line. And if we do want to do an alternative view of, say, a little bit different view, we got to find the funding through various other means. So at the end of the day, this most important, I guess, for us is where do we get the funding and how do we just put our stories across, the stories that we want to tell and the ones that we do to obviously pay the bills.
And I think that's really interesting because, you know, the truth is in many countries in the world, what people are doing is trying to do that search for truth and investigate and reveal and document and so on in obviously censorious and authoritarian circumstances, or, you know, where it's clear. And I suppose that's what's so ironic about being in places like Britain, where that's not obviously what's happening, and yet ironically there's a huge amount of self-censorship in order to kind of toe the line that's not imposed by anyone, but kind of we all know if you say the wrong thing you're going to be kicked out of the dinner party, let alone, you know, and there is a kind of mood that there's certain things you can't say, you'd be on the wrong side. And I think that's very dangerous. That gentleman there, and then that lady there.
There is a way to sort of present, to prevent sort of too much bias, which is basically just use the scientific method. Like, you have to provide references, you debunk rather than pretend you proved. And I don't understand why newspapers don't have references at the bottom of articles.
You mean footnotes?
Yeah. And so you can actually check sources, you know, if you wanted.
That'll be the day, you know, the hacks on footnotes. You know.
Well, I mean, I'm going to do that with the film.
I love the idea of footnoting the Sun.
Yeah.
The Sun footnoting.
I'm linking to all the papers I'm using as reference and everything on the website that goes with the film because it's basically a. I don't understand why people don't already do it in journalism.
But is it not? I mean, I'm a great fan of the scientific method applied to science. I'm a bit nervous when it gets applied to other things. The only reason I was asking was just like in terms of judgment. I mean, some things are intuitive. I mean, it's not just. I mean, documentaries might be trying to find the truth, but it's not just kind of a fact thing. You know, I prove to you that I've interviewed this person. You can check it up. And sometimes you're trying to ask questions that are awkward questions.
But in terms of, I mean, science doesn't work by proving anything. It just disproves the rubbish, and you see what you got left with.
Yeah.
I mean, that's.
I'm simply saying that in order to prove that you have asked the, you can't have a situation whereby you say, "I promise that I've asked the right questions." We're talking about documentaries that don't ask certain questions.
You can also discuss whether you said when it's not too much bias, but can it be too much bias? It's either bias or it's not bias, isn't it?
Yes, but you can only disprove and see what you're left with. That still might be wrong.
Yeah, it's evidence-based documentary making. It might be. I hope it doesn't catch on because it sounds dull, but very. I mean, I just think, oh no, I don't want films that only have things that are provable in them, or we'll all.
No, it's not a case of that. It's a case you don't have things in it that are disprovable. It's the opposite.
Yes, I know what you're saying. I do understand what you're saying. Yeah, this lady needs. I'll get you a mic straight away because you should make that point because it sounded interesting. But that lady, let's make it now and then we'll come.
Sorry for interrupting, but yes, I mean what you're talking about is current affairs films where you have fact checking, you know, inevitably as part of your job. But with documentaries, it's far more subtle. You know, you are, as Meta said, you're not. There are some questions you're not asking, and that's the subtlety in getting to the truth. So how do you fact-check that I didn't ask the question? I mean, how can you do that?
Okay, thank you. So that lady there, right, that can be argued over afterwards. That lady there now.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Fisher. I'm a journalist and a programme maker. And I have to say, I wasn't going to talk about this, but as far as attributing facts in newspapers is concerned, everything in there should be a quote from a source who is named. And there are two sides to it, I would say, far more than I found in program making. That's not a criticism of either. What I was going to say is, we're talking about whether your source of funding gives you some kind of bias in your program making. And I'm thinking about access. And don't we always, in order to get access, compromise to some extent, even if it's just that you become attached to the person that you've been living with for 6 months filming, and there might be something that happens that you think, actually, do we really need to show that? And so, what fundamental question, what really is the truth? We're already self-censoring in that way, and I suppose I'm saying, and I'd like to know from the panel, what you would see the difference as compromising or not telling the whole truth to get access. I mean, just think of the celebrity interviews you see in the newspapers. That's an extreme version of journalism where you can't talk about their private life, you can't talk about this, but they want the interview, and so they agree to that. Mm-hmm. I've just watched an amazing documentary about the president of the Maldives. Now, I came out thinking that should be a compulsory program for everyone to see, and what's the other side? And then I come in here and I think, yes, what is the other side? Mm-hmm. Because in fact, what did they? I mean, he seemed like an incredibly nice man. It was set up; he'd been tortured. He was a very credible character. They had amazing access. They were in the hotel room with him. You saw him sort of taking his socks off. So they must have become quite close to this man. And I just wonder, you got the feeling it was very open, but how open was it? What did they agree to? And certainly, is there another side to this country's going to be underwater? Maybe there isn't, and maybe you don't need to show it, but certainly it wasn't shown, it wasn't documented.
Okay. I'll take this lady here, because there's quite a lot for the panel to come back on, but this lady here in the front, no, because I want you all to come on that, because that seems to me a fairly key. Yeah, go on.
Lydia Box. I've literally just started on my journey. I've been an independent.
Right, but we can't hear
independent filmmaker. Sorry, I have to really talk into it. And regarding whether to be funded by corporations or NGOs or state-funded, public-funded, and all the rest of it, I think it's a question of why. Why are they funding? What's their objective? And back to what you were saying, and whether you can be truly independent or truly objective. And I think that I probably have more different objectives of doing this film than a huge corporation. A corporation is more likely to either be wanting to improve their brand, to enhance their brand, or for plain simply just to make more money. I hopefully are in it for the sake of doing it for the art. So it's all to do basically with why. And why did Shell decide to fund the Ideas Institute? Be an interesting answer to that question.
I'll make that my concluding remark. Okay, so listen, because we're... Just hold on, let me just... Can I check the time? Yeah. Is there anyone else who'd like to say anything? Shall I... I mean, I just thought I'd give the panel a chance to come back, but if there's any last sort of... If you're dying to say something, now might be the moment, that's all I'm saying. Am I missing anyone? No.
Can I just say something to that current affairs discussion? Because of course.
Yeah. No. Well, I'm going to say to you now. Just let's kind of round up. So pick up a question. Yeah. So I thought if everyone picks up one question they want to say, but then also, as it was, some bit of your final thought for the day, as it were.
Okay.
So Alex,
on the discussion about current affairs, of course. On the BBC, current affairs is unsponsorable. And actually on commercial TV in Britain, it's also unsponsorable because that's what the Ofcom guidelines say. So these questions would only come up in pure independent filmmaking, and those films couldn't be on TV in Britain, actually. So in a way, that's a kind of side issue if we're thinking about TV here, which I agree with, not necessarily. But that'd be my point. So actually, the British regulations help us to a great degree because they already mitigate against, if you like, corruption by corporations of news, current affairs, and children's programming.
And your final thought?
That would be it.
Okay, thanks, Alex. No, that's succinct. Jennifer?
Just a couple of things that have occurred to me during this conversation. For one, with response to your question, a film called Unraveled. I don't know whether you've seen it, but it's currently making the circuit now. It's about a man who was indicted for, Mark Dreyer, his name is, he was indicted for huge fraud in the United States on the same level as Bernie Madoff, but a less famous case. And a film was made about showing his last days at home in his penthouse prior to reporting to jail for what's going to be the rest of his life. And it's a fascinating film, I think never revealed within the film itself is the fact that the man who made the film is a former employee of Mark Dreyer's. Does the audience deserve to know that when they're seeing the film? Does that impact their impression? My answer is yes, it does, and as long as there's disclosure within that film, that's fine. But there was no disclosure. I mean, everybody knew about it afterwards, and it was widely reported in the press, but I think it should have been within the film itself. That is a journalistic responsibility. Same thing with the Dixie Chicks, Stand Up and Shut Up and Sing. Barbara Koppel was hired by them to make that film. That should have been evident in the film. It was never mentioned in the film. Does that impact an audience's perception of the film? I think so, yes. A second thing is about accepting corporate funding or funding from any NGO or anything else. I've spoken with a lot of filmmakers about this. On the subject of corporate funding, when you mention it, they shrivel. They don't like it. They don't want to do it. But on second thought, they think they may have to. One of the things that I have really asked them to do is come on record about their opinions about it. They are terrified to do that, really frightened to do it. So that is something that informs me also about the current status of our filmmaker population and with regard to corporate funding. One filmmaker whom I respect tremendously, and I will say her name because she said that I could, is Anne Aguillon, who's made a lot of very, very fine films, and I think her ethical stand is above question in anything. But she said that her solution for this is that she never accepts majority funding from any entity whatsoever, so that she can never be accused of having had undue influence on her by any particular NGO, state, television or private corporation or anybody. It's all divided out so that it's very clear and very transparent. I think that that's a saving grace. Transparency is a key issue. It's a major issue. This, as I said, is a slippery slope. I think every filmmaker has to make their own decision about where they're willing to go. Yes, I do think it's going to be very difficult, for example, for Joe Berlinger to make another film, especially if he's going to be criticizing GE or any of GE's products, because GE can always go to him and say, hey, Joe, you are on our team. And that is a really dangerous position for a filmmaker to be in. And I love Joe Berlinger's work. I want him to go on making films. And I just think that people have to be very, very careful about what they accept. Fund your doc, but at what price?
Okay, thank you very much, Jennifer. Meta?
Well, I think it is a very sort of blowing market, and I think it is, I know it's hard for filmmakers to make a living. So we probably have to, I mean, I agree with you with transparency, just like with the country-to-country reporting in Africa. We need that in all aspects. I mean, I think the contract you make in a film with the viewers are very important. I remember when I did the Burma VJ, I had many discussions with a filmmaker who did not want to put a card up that some of the scenes were staged or dramatized. And I said, but you'll get people will get really upset when they get hard through the film and say it could never have happened that he was there at that time. And so the compromise, or there was no compromise actually, I put a card up at Danish TV. I think the rest of the world and all the festivals, there were no cards, and I had calls from filmmakers, other filmmakers and colleagues from around the world saying, I saw this film, and then I got really upset because, I realized that there were scenes that were reconstructed. I did the same when we did a film about squat. We didn't do a film. I was presented with lots of material from a young filmmaker who was part of the squatting community in Copenhagen, and there was these huge riots, and it was really fantastic material, but it was all from the inside. And he kind of wanted to present the film as a current affairs, political documents, and you have to make it personal. So I stole from Alex Gibney's Gonzo film, so I placed him in an editing room, and he was tapping up, my name is this and this, and I'm one of the squatters, and I've filmed this from the inside. And then you have a contract with the viewer, and you know who's telling the story, and the viewer is all from the beginning. I mean, as you said, who employs who with the Dixie, what do they call the Dixie chicks?
The Dixie
yeah,
chicks,
so you know that, and I think that's very important. I think it's also very important with your funders, whether you are commissioned by broadcasters, to be very, very open about what you're doing and where your money comes from. And a lot of the money, I mean, I have to say no as soon as it's you have the Puma Award or Hilton Award, and so we cannot go into any of the BritDoc films because it's funded the way it is. And that is, of course, not so good. I think that that means as a filmmaker you sell yourself out. Maybe you don't get any money from BritDoc, but it's funded in a way so we cannot commission, we cannot co-produce. We can buy it when it's completed, but we cannot be part of your financing. And I think that is a problem. And maybe you would have gotten more money from me than you got from Puma or Hilton.
Get a good lunch from Puma.
You get very good lunches.
Okay, thanks. Nick?
Thanks to Jennifer, because I just acquired Unraveled, and I will certainly include this piece of information, which I don't think, it doesn't lessen your appreciation of film. It's a really great film, by the way.
It's a great film.
And a film that tells you so much about, real corporate malfeasance in a clever way. But you need to know that. George Orwell said, rather mystifyingly, all art is propaganda. And he meant that, nothing is wholly innocent. There's always a crime, there's always a criminal, there's always some piece of corruption somewhere in the back of almost every activity on Earth. But I think, before I get to the BBC, I mean, the best thing is just to be honest about it. And filmmakers, I'm afraid, have to be especially honest. Even more honest, I'm afraid, than TV executives. The worst thing that happened to filmmakers, they lose the ability to make their money, whereas TV executives get shunted onto what used to be called the head of carpets at the BBC. Anyway, what do I think about the BBC? At the moment, filmmakers tend to think of the BBC as being tough against them in these matters, like they think of the BBC as a kind of fortress defending its virtue. And I really, really think this should not be the case. The BBC should acknowledge the contemporary world and get on the side of filmmakers, because actually, the BBC, with what it's supposed to do in its charter, ought to be helping filmmakers to be independent, not hindering them in their dealing with third parties. There are places such as the Wellcome Trust or all the Soros Institutes or the Ford Foundation the BBC has to get better at dealing with.
It's all been centralized in Sundance, I mean, there is still...
Well,
you cannot go to Soros today because he would say, we put the money at Sundance, and so has Skull, and so has... they've all
my wish is that we should be simpler in our dealings, but give more power to the likes of people like myself, and trust us in our dealings with filmmakers, and fire us if we make mistakes.
Okay, Jennifer wants to clarify something. I want to round up, and then
I just wanted to say one other thing. It's a really it's a very, very important distinction in this discussion, and we have not really pointed it out yet. There is a big difference between documentary and branded content. And as long as we keep that clear, and you want to do something that's called branded content, that's fine. But when we're talking about documentary, there's a kind of a holy mission involved, as far as I'm concerned, that has to be kept distinct. And I just wanted to mention that. I mean, the discussion about branded content is a very different one than the discussion about documentary film.
Okay, I think as well, there's probably quite a lot. I mean, there's loads of other things that need to be thought about. I think that there's no sense in which this would or should indicate that filmmakers should be neutral, in the sense that people will actually often say to me, "How can you chair debates? You're not neutral." And I always think, what would a neutral person look like? I mean, what is a neutral person? I mean, surely you have opinions, and you kind of, but that's not to say that one shouldn't be fair, but you can be robust and intervene. And I think in filmmaking there's something of that. So it's not that you want to kind of pretend that films have kind of got no interest, and then but it's the filmmaker's independence and interest that's important. I also think that what really Messi said at the beginning is the thing that I think is very important is, I think, and I say this, audiences are ill-served. I mean, I really think that what audiences can fall in love with documentary when they confuse and complicate the worldview you had when you start, by the end of them that you started with, where they don't follow the script. And actually, one thing I would put out as a slight warning is, actually, being against big corporations is part of the script. So we also have to be wary of, it's become kind of like big business bashing. It's like the most, it's only involved in politics. No, but I'm saying that's not to say that one shouldn't have an in-depth understanding of what's going on in the corporate world. We have to understand the economy, but if you take a big pharmaceutical company that's full of some of the most brilliant scientists in the world, the Wellcome Trust is a trust, but it also started off as a pharmaceutical company, and they work with a lot of the scientists who work in pharmaceuticals who will discover some of the solutions to the problems of the world's sick, and die and come up with, and so on and so forth. So again, just like documentary, it's a more complicated story, and it's a more complicated story and so that's what drives me mad, is a kind of propaganda that kind of just assumes that we all just. I can tell the answer to every single. You can tell. Banker bashing, anti-corporate, certain environmental. There's a shtick, right? And you kind of go there and you think, oh God, and it's rife throughout the curriculum in school. So I don't know how any kids don't get so bored rigid. And then the idea that they go and see a documentary and it says exactly the same thing to them. You just think it's a bit more complicated than that. So that would be what I'd say as a viewer. My final thing, because somebody asked, is why would somebody in a corporation sponsor something like the Institute of Ideas or Sheffield Doc Festival or anything else? In a way, that's their business, right? They can do with it what they want. I run things and I go and I say I want funding to anyone who will give it to me. But because I don't think they're all evil for a start-off, I happen to, as it happens, be rather enthusiastic about energy and the gains that energy has given to humanity. And so I'm not embarrassed about it. I wouldn't take money from somebody I didn't agree with what they produced. I'm less embarrassed about what they produced. What I don't want is to be part of their bloody CSR agenda. And I certainly don't. I say, I get money from this company, and I'm not embarrassed about getting money from this company. I'm not embarrassed by what they do, because this is not only happening in documentaries. I do a lot of work with arts and culture. Some of the finest exhibitions that I've seen have been funded by corporates. Undoubtedly, they're doing it so that we all like them and think they're fluffy. But in view of the fact there's no state money to fund those exhibitions, I go in and look at the art. Notice the logo, but look at the art. And the artists are capable of making great art that then has the responsibility to be put on. So that sort of stuff, fine. The insidious, we all know where we're going, we know what the answer is stuff, is the things that I would urge you to look out for. If Shell offer you money, you're all going to be wary. But NSPCC offers you money, you might think, oh, well, that's wonderful because they're interested in children and I like children and this can't be a bad thing. NSPCC are a huge charity with a lot of interests, a lot of political interests, and you should at least be critical and go, I don't know whether they're going to skew the outcome of this film, etc., etc. So if you leave this being a bit more sceptical, that's all right with me. If you want to hear more from Nick, and it'll be less from me then, at 2 o'clock at the town hall, or otherwise see you in the bar. Okay, thank you very much. Can we thank our panel, please? What?